Good evening, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me. And my guest is none other than Dr. E. Michael Jones, the editor of The Culture Wars and many books. Dr. Jones, my favorite book of yours originally was Degenerate Moderns, which really had a big impact on me. I know that other people have noticed that about you and you're reading your books, and I understand why. I mean, it's a very powerful and direct social commentary. Your most recent book, Walking with a Bible and a Gun, I think seems to me to be a continuation of the Jewish revolutionary spirit, which primarily from my reading was about conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. This book brings things more to the United States and the what you describe and quite accurately as the Anglo-Protestant culture or category, as you call it. And so I want to start by asking you to give a bit of a thumbnail definition of what you mean by the Anglo-Protestant culture of the United States and its origins, which you note, and I think accurately, in as emanating out of Boston and the Puritan Bay Colony.
Yeah, well, this is about it's a book about American identity, about the loss of American identity, which with what is ironically known as identity politics. Um, there was the end of the whole era of identity politics was about the year 2000, and at this point, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called "Who Are We?" in reaction to identity politics, and he came up with the exact opposite of what identity politics was. He said, "We are Anglo Protestants." It's that simple, and he based it on basically Massachusetts. He made a distinction between settlers and immigrants. Settlers set the form, and immigrants conform to the form that they set. And so the people who set the form in Massachusetts were the Puritans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right in seeing that as having roots in the Jewish revolutionary spirit, because the Puritans were Judaizers. They were revolutionaries and they were Judaizers. And they came over to the United States, what was America, Massachusetts Bay Colony, after they had become odious to the English. The experiment, the revolutionary era was the 1640s. The Puritans had murdered the king, killed the king. They were odious in the eyes of the English, and there was the Restoration. And at this point, they were looking for an exit ramp, and they found it to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, one of the Puritans, probably the most famous Puritan who didn't come over, was John Milton, the Puritan poet. At this point in his life, he was blind. He was an old man. He was hated by everyone, and he came within an inch of being hanged for regicide. He should have been hanged for regicide, but Andrew Marvell, the poet, pleaded for mercy for him, and so he got off. And so he spent the last part of his life sitting every day dictating this poem that came out of his mind every night after he was asleep. And the poem was Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost, I'm saying, is the hidden grammar of American identity, because it's the hidden grammar of Puritanism. And Puritanism was the dominant Protestant sect in America. Much more. There were lots of them. There were the Quakers in Philadelphia, but Boston became the intellectual capital of the United States of America, largely because of all the great writers that came out of there. And I started off by talking about those people, Nathaniel Hawthorne being the most famous, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and so on and so forth.
Right, the existentialists, they call them. And Samuel Huntington also, I believe, authored the Islam's Bloody Borders, which I think is a fascinating theory, and how that divides the world between those two categories, the world of war and the world of Islam. But with regard to the Puritans, how are the Puritans Judaizers? What is it about them that imitates Judaism?
First of all, what you had with the Reformation was a crisis of authority. The Reformation broke with the Catholic Church. No one had broken with the Catholic Church before Luther.
Mhm.
And once you break with that church, you're breaking with the apostolic succession, which
Right.
means that basically your bishop goes per the previous bishop, and that goes all the way back to the first bishop, who was Peter, who was appointed to be head of the church by Jesus Christ himself. And so they had that authority. What happens when you break with the authority? They have to go to the Old Testament, basically, or they call it sola scriptura. They come up with three principles: sola fide, by faith alone; sola gratia, by grace alone; and sola scriptura, by the Bible alone.
Right.
Well, when they go to the Bible, let me give you an example of John Milton. John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, married a woman, and the woman didn't particularly like the life of a lonely poet. She had a lively family, and she left and went back to her family. And Milton's upset, and at the same time he's upset, he finds another woman that seems pretty attractive to him, and so he's interested in divorce. Now, he believes in sola scriptura, right?
Right.
All you have to do is appeal to the Bible. Well, it turns out that Jesus Christ had some unpleasant things to say about divorce. In other words, if you give divorce and remarry, you're committing adultery. Milton didn't like that. So what's he going to do? What do you do in a situation like you go to the Old Testament? And this is the essence of where the Judaizing comes from.
Okay.
You give an Englishman the Bible, and he immediately, as I said, goes to the Old Testament. And the first thing, he likes those stories. And the first thing he thinks of is, I am Gideon.
I understand.
And if I am Gideon, then everybody I don't like is Amalek. And Oliver Cromwell did it with the Amalek was the Irish Catholics, who he now had a right to slaughter because Joshua and Gideon had been given this command by God to slaughter the inhabitants. And that's the essence of the Judaizing. That's the link between the lack of authority, the Judaizing, and the Old Testament.
And also, Henry VIII was broke with the church because he wanted divorce, I seem to recall. I think that in this sense, Judaism is very similar to Catholicism and vice versa, in that Judaism is not based on sola scriptura. We have a process that's similar to the Catholics who are into scholasticism, in that it's our rabbis, our sages, our interpreters, starting with the Talmud itself, basically puts the Torah into contexts that work with existing conditions to kind of not modernize, and it doesn't contradict, but it explains and it interprets, and it allows for the Israelites to continue the covenant through the 2,000 years of diaspora. So Judaism is not, the Old Testament is put in a context, in a way, but you're quite right about Luther and the Protestant movement, which basically stripped away commentary. It stripped away the scholastic approach of the Catholics, and it went right to the fundamental literal word. Now, as far as Amalek is concerned, I think that your interpretation of that is not the Jewish interpretation. We look at God's command, and that is, by the way, the God that you and I both revere, the God of what you call the Old Testament, the God that we both believe in. He commanded the Israelite caravan to kill the Amalekites, not because of their race and not because of their ethnic background, but because of their actions. It's because of what they did. It's the same reason why God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. The Amalekites had attacked the Israelite caravan from behind, which was where women and children and the infirm and the elderly were. And it was such an evil act. It was really the world's first terrorism act. And it so disrupted the Logos, as you like to refer to, that there was no redeeming from it. But at the same time, there was always the possibility of an individual becoming redeemed who might have a Amalekite background. And that the claim that they had to be destroyed was because their actions were so evil and they were so unrepentant that they threatened to pollute the entire world. They threatened to overthrow the order of the entire universe. and that the Torah and the Talmud also further pushes this idea that there are no more Amalekites in terms of a tribal identity, that they had been dispersed among all the nations, but there are still actions that be described as like Amalek. And when that happens, there has to be an orderly and very carefully defined system of justice where people who engage in that kind of evil are brought to consequence, and that could include the death penalty. So I think there's a misinterpretation there. The Amalekites were punished because of their actions, not because of their ethnic background.
Well, you're right. There's a difference in interpretation here. I think basically that I don't see it that way. It seems to me that God gave us life. God takes our lives away, and if God tells you to kill someone, you kill someone. Okay. The problem is, how do you know whether God's telling you that, or how do you know you're just not crazy? And how can you tolerate someone who does this by invoking some type of divine commission and have that compatible with any civil society? You can't. And this is precisely the problem here. When you have this sola scriptura, when you have this Protestant mentality, you're above the law. And if you're above the law, how do we adjudicate these conflicts? And that's precisely what happened at this period of time with these various Protestant sects who were all infallible. That's the problem. So you can take the Quakers in Philadelphia. How did the Bostonians deal with the Philadelphians? Well, the Bostonians, the Puritans, hanged the Quakers when they showed up in Boston. You can't talk to a Quaker. A Quaker is infallible. Every time the Quaker opens his mouth, you're talking to the Holy Spirit. That's what their religious practice tells them. That's what they believe, I think. So that ends discussion. So Digby also said the difference between Boston and Philadelphia was that Boston had discourse and Philadelphia did not. And so as a result, Philadelphia became famous for painting, where there's basically no arguing. You're just going to paint pictures, and that's that. Okay. But this was the fundamental problem that the founding fathers had to deal with when they tried to unite all of these colonies and come up with some type of modus vivendi. And so what they did is basically say, well, I don't care what your religion is. We're not going to have it as part of our government. There will be no established church. Now, that developed over time, and de facto, you had an Episcopalian church and a Congregational church that were de facto the established churches, but there could be no established church for all 13 colonies. That was impossible.
Right. I mean, I think that basically the Puritans, after the Salem witch trial hysteria, it changed them, and they kind of moved away from this kind of state religion orientation. And today the Puritans are the Congregationalist churches. They're all over New England, and that they're very decentralized. They don't have a structure. Each church decides for itself what the Bible says, and that's why you have amongst the Congregationalists some very, very religious, conservative groups, and some very ultra liberal left-wing groups that are very similar to the Unitarians. But the national government, I think, in Washington and the founding fathers embraced the ideas of Roger Williams, who founded the Rhode Island colony, which was Baptist, and that was religious freedom, and that the individual and that the church was free to worship God in their way and without much state interference at all.
I think that they followed Satan. I think that the point that stunned me when I actually looked into it was all of the founding fathers who were reading Milton's Paradise Lost at the time of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was reading it. John Adams, the opposite end of the political spectrum, was reading it. Tom Paine, who wrote the most influential pamphlet in American history at this time, quoted directly from Satan's Paradise Lost as the justification for breaking with England. And I think that over the period of time that these people all hated Puritanism. They all hated Calvinism. They were in direct reaction to it. They were Enlightenment figures, if anything, but yet they retained the gist of Milton's Paradise Lost by this notion of non serviam. No one's going to tell me what to do. You know, we are independent. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. That's right out of Satan's speech. And Tom Paine didn't quote that exactly, but he quoted passages all around it. I'm saying over this period of time, we had what we call a distillation of Calvinism in light of their experience on the frontier. And what came out of this distillation was this rejection of authority, this kind of Protestant non serviam, a rejection of the Catholic Church that got extrapolated now to the government in England, and then beyond that until the point of like Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is clearly satanic all the way at the end. Like you get to define your own being according to the mystery clause in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I'm saying that is the strain that is all from beginning to end here.
I mean, you mentioned Thomas Paine. I think it was not so much a rejection of authority, but it was a distrust of authority. That is very much an American thing, and that's why we have a constitution which is supposed to rein in authority and balance it through a system of checks and balances. I think that also Adams talked about the fact that our society with a constitution can only work with the assumption that we are a religious and a moral people. And I think that while they may have read Paradise Lost, they also read the Bible. And certainly Thomas Jefferson's distilled one of the most basic principles, which is that all men are created equal, which comes right out of Genesis, which is that God created men and women in his image, that every life is sacred and that's of value, and that emanating from that is individual freedom. And then we set up societies in order to protect and preserve that individual freedom. We don't really worship authority. We distrust authority. And that's why we have limited government. I mean, I think that probably is a Protestant ethos. Now, you talk about the melting pot being Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. And I think that's true. However, the only thing I'd add to it is that I think American society, as you say, is Protestant with a small p. I think that American Catholics and American Jews, that we've been Protestantized in many ways, for better or for worse. We could talk about some of the stuff that the materialism and the lack of spirituality that I think is inherent in these Protestant sects, and that both Judaism and Catholicism in America have lost a bit of. I think that in the broad sense, we are a Protestant nation.
Well, yeah, he said, I mean, we're immigrants. We're not settlers. The Protestants were the settlers. The Puritans were the settlers, and they set the form. And
Sure.
When you're an immigrant, you conform to the form. And so we had, my great aunts were maids in the houses of the rich WASP elite on the main line in Philadelphia. Okay, and we were, in a sense, we adopted because we assimilated. We're becoming Americans in some sense or the other. And then at a certain point, it came in conflict. It's always been, the Catholics were always odious to the Protestant majority. Even after the Civil War, you had these Thomas Nast, the cartoons of they're called the Ganges or something. They're the bishops with their mitres. They look like crocodiles, and they're crawling into America. They're going to eat up the Americans. But the problem came after World War II, when basically the WASP elite declared war on the Catholics through social engineering. And the crucial figure in that regard was Paul Blanchard, who wrote books called American Freedom and Catholic Power. Now, up to that time, we had a moral consensus. And I think the moral consensus substituted for the established religion. You had to have a moral consensus. That's what John Adams said. We have no constitution that functions in the absence of a moral people. And just early on, you had a paradox. The paradox being epitomized by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's a Satanist when he thinks. It's in Self-Reliance, which is a quintessentially satanic essay. And one of the people says to him, he says, nothing matters but the integrity of your own mind. He got that from Milton. Milton says the mind is, Satan in Milton says the mind is its own place.
Right.
And then someone says to him, well, that may be from below. And then Emerson says, well, it's from the devil. If it's from the devil, I am of the devil's party. That sounds satanic to me. But on the other hand, he believed in the marital, being faithful in your marriage. He believed in chastity. And I'd gotten into an argument with Carlyle and Dickens when he was in England about the chastity of American men. He said, all American men go to their marriage beds as virgins. He shocked both of them. This is the paradox. How long can this hold together? It's a contradiction. Those people went to church. The churches, I think, shared a moral consensus until, crucially, in sexual matters, until the 20th century. And then the Protestant churches adopted contraception, and that broke the moral consensus. And then the Jews came along and started promoting abortion during this period of time, and that broke it as well. And by the end of the 20th century, the moral consensus was gone, and you had nothing holding the Americans together anymore.
Well, what you seem to be describing is a philosophy, which I do agree with you is satanic, in that the individual gets to invent morality. They get to invent reality, really. And it was Whittaker Chambers who talked about this in his introduction to his famous book, Witness, where he says that we have a choice in this world between the worship of God or the worship of man, and that the communist movement represented, by whatever it's called in any generation, the worship of man. It was the temptation of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, that you can know God, you can be as God, you can know all things. In other words, you can overthrow God. And that's what he contends the communist movement had been doing in every generation ever since. And we could look at history. We could look at attempts by Nimrod to build a tower to heaven so he could slay God cut his head off. And he was knocked down to earth, and you had the development of the nations. And that every generation has had to deal with this sort of what I would call an unnatural, informal conspiracy to overthrow God and to create a man-based utopia on earth. That sounds to me like what Milton was probably into. That certainly is the satanic influence, as the serpent in the garden represents Satan, and that it runs contrary to a God-based society. Now, you mentioned that after World War II, you had the Protestant influence with contraception and the Jewish influence with abortion. I can't speak to the Protestant element, although I think that there you have a church that has been splintered into hundreds of pieces. So each one maybe has a different take on things. But as far as Judaism is concerned, I would contend, and I've written books on this topic, that we have been heavily infiltrated, if not co-opted in certain ways, by a satanic movement that started with a false messiah, that being Shabtai Zvi and Jacob Frank, his follower. And that got the camel's nose under the tent, and that introduced a satanic and atheistic approach that led to a communistic movement, I think, and that unfortunately has dominated much of American Jewish institutional thinking. And there were a lot of Jews like myself and many others who are trying to fight that and expose it, because it's not natural, first of all, but secondly, it's not consistent with the Jewish covenant. It's not consistent with the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah, which are absolute, which do recognize the existence of a reality that was created outside the hands of men.
Right. Rabbi Sam Dresner was like this. He felt the same way. He wrote a book called Can the Family Survive in America? He was a fan of my work. We talked together until he died. He died. He called me the last time I spoke to him. He called me, told me he was writing a book on homosexuality. I was obviously against it. He was appalled at the fact that books were disappearing from the libraries in New York. They were being deliberately destroyed because they provided evidence for his thesis. He even suggested to me that I take the notes that he had written and finish the book for him. So, yeah, this was a problem, and I've made this distinction before. You have to distinguish between the Jews and all Jews. And after, I'm saying that after the crucial moment, and this was crucial for conservatism as well, was when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And 400 Jewish organizations came out and said that abortion's a fundamental Jewish value. That killed conservatism because it killed the whole idea of Judeo-Christian morality. There was no, LifeSite News had its basically constitution said it was based on the Judeo-Christian position on abortion. That ceased to exist at that point. The Jews came out full force in support of abortion. That killed Judeo-Christian morality. That killed conservatism. And that fractured whatever moral consensus existed before that time.
You know, it's what you're describing is a disgraceful situation. However, there is a little nuance to that in that, and because I looked into this, I've heard you make that charge, and I've done somewhat of a dive on that. And what I would say is that other than a handful of left-wing Jewish groups or groups that call themselves Jewish, and they are Jewish, who actually do condone abortion, the rest of them were simply saying that they don't condone abortion, but they don't think that it should be made illegal because you have to protect the life of the mother. That the Talmud also gets into this, that if you have an abortion because it's elective, because you want to, then you know you're going to be hanged in hell. You know, they literally describe a death penalty that's very brutal. But if the unborn child is threatening the life of the mother, then that unborn child becomes an enemy. And the mother's life is paramount. So I think that, you know, if you put it in the modern context, which has affected all of our society, because both Jew and Catholic and Protestant, you have people who mindlessly believe in pro-choice without actually thinking about what abortion is, then yeah, that's a very negative and dangerous development. But the fact of the matter is that these Jewish groups are not condoning abortion, and that abortion is not allowed in Judaism. We're not as conservative as Catholicism. That's true, in that there was a council of rabbis who studied the issue in the Middle Ages. And, you know, they said, well, we don't want to come off as moral than the Pope, who, by the way, European Judaism looked to as the ultimate religious authority in the world. But we believe that the how should I put this? The soul enters the womb after 40 days. And I'm not here to endorse or reject that position.
There was a woman, I don't know if you remember this, but there's a woman, Jewish lady there, right after Roe versus Wade gets overturned. She's obviously pregnant. She lifts up her shirt and she writes on her stomach, this bulging stomach, "Not a human."
Mike, I've seen those kinds of protests all over the country from radical leftists. They're Jewish and not Jewish. It's a terrible disgrace, obviously, and it's completely contradicting Jewish law, which respects every life as sacred, including the unborn. You know, again, I mean, the issue in even amongst after that decision was made, I actually went to a talk with liberal Jews who wanted to discuss abortion. And even they admitted, through gritted teeth maybe, that abortion is not allowed in Judaism. It's not condoned. It's simply an issue of like making sure the government doesn't pass laws that might lead to the death of the mother, that it's really a decision made by rabbis. I mean, back in the day, the woman would go to the rabbi and the decision, there'd be a debate and there'd be a medical decision made. But it was only in absolutely serious situations where the life of the mother was threatened. So I think that, you know, I want to just give some nuance to that position. And that the idea that abortion is allowed and promoted in this country has more to do, I think, with a leftist agenda that wants to not only devalue human life, but also control human life. They want to control who lives and who dies. They want to control reality. That's why they're behind this whole transgender thing, right? They want to decide who gets to be assigned a man or a woman when they're born. I mean, it's getting crazier all the time. Who knows what they're going to do next? But these things are maybe this is part of what you're describing with this kind of like Milton thing where you get to invent reality. But it contradicts the Jewish covenant. It certainly contradicts the morals and ethical precepts of Sinai.
Well, you're in a similar situation to the Protestants because you don't have a pope. So who gets to decide? It becomes, I've been through this with Ben Shapiro. He showed up here in South Bend to give a talk. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, no, that's not true. I said, Ben, you're one guy. You're one Jew. I got 400 Jewish organizations that say the opposite here. Unless you're the Jewish Pope, it's going to be the numbers are going to rule here. The state of Indiana now has an exemption to its abortion law for Jews, a religious exemption for Jews.
That's crazy.
I was in a similar situation to Rabbi Dresner. I was in Mashhad in Iran, and Rabbi David Weiss of Netarai Karta's there. I stood up and I said, if all Jews were like Rabbi David Weiss, we wouldn't be here, would we?
Yeah.
If you were content, if you thought that Zionism was an abomination, which is what he believes, if you thought that if you're happy to live in your ghetto, and you're not going to go around overturning the laws, for example, the laws on abortion in New York and California, followed by a total overturning of all the laws, fine. That's part of the American covenant. You can have your religion, okay? But your religion is contextualized by a moral consensus that everyone shares. If you work to overturn that moral consensus, there's going to be trouble. And we got trouble because of that.
The religion is defined by the moral and ethical precepts of Sinai. That is something that has developed. You're right, we don't have a pope since the destruction of the temple. But however it's happened, we have had people who we call Torah true Jews who have continued in every generation. I mean, every generation from the day of Abraham until today, every day before the sun sets, you have 10 circumcised bar mitzvahed Jewish men come together and form a minyan and recite certain prayers. And those prayers basically contain the precepts of Jewish faith, also the precepts of Maimonides' 13 principles, which are recited in every synagogue every day. And those 13 principles are the principles upon which we draw guidance and that we live by, and that they're consistent with the Torah, as is the word and the responsa. So yes, we don't have a pope, but somehow we've been able to continue. It's actually miraculous as a consistent body of moral and ethical work. Now you have these idiots who claim to speak for Judaism. Nobody speaks for Judaism. I mean, that's Wait
a minute, you're speaking for Judaism right now, aren't you?
No, I'm not. I'm giving my own opinion. I am looking at the body of Jewish work that exists outside of any person that has evolved over millennia, that is derived from the Torah. And as I said, the Torah true Jews, they're not contradicting the Torah. They are working with the revelation at Sinai, which is the word of God. And they are basically expostulating in a way that it can fit in our life and that can guide us. And that true Jews are guided by the precepts of the Torah, by the 13 precepts of Maimonides. There is a
okay. I agree with you. If all Jews follow the Torah, we wouldn't have the problems that we have now.
Indeed.
But all Jews do not follow the Torah. This was Rabbi Dresner's complaint. He named one Jew after. He hated Woody Allen. Woody Allen was probably the most prominent Jew. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine as an American genius in the 1970s. Rabbi Dresner hated Woody Allen because he was shanda for the goyim. basically what he was saying.
Well, in a way, he's held up by the establishment as an example of a Jew, and he's a horrible example. He's a cultural figure. They should have instead put Abraham Joshua Heschel on the cover. There were many Jewish thinkers who are consistent with Torah development, who were looking at what the Sabbath means, what it means to worship God. I mean, there's some fantastic literature that came out at that time also, which was ignored. Chaim Patak is another man who developed incredible literature about Jewish morality and how it intersects with one's personal life and how one functions within it. We could took it.
Look, in a sense, I had this experience in my own life. I'm telling you that the Jews I knew when I was a teenager are not. There was no Rabbi Shmuley back then. I guarantee you, there was no Rabbi Shmuley at that point. These were people that it was a different generation. It was a different era. And in a sense, I found it so persuasive that I became a Jew. I'm telling you now that I became a Jew when I was 19, 20 years old. I used to say that I stopped going to church, but the reason I stopped going to church was because I became a Jew. And because it seemed to me that they had a more persuasive argument about why they did things. So I went to I worked for Sam Mayton, Jewish artist. I had a priest who introduced me to the art world in Philadelphia. And the art world was Jewish. It was dominated by Jews. So I worked for Sam Mayton. I used to sit with him on Saturday mornings and we'd talk, and then I'd work and we'd talk, did a lot of talking. I worked for two Jewish ladies who had an art gallery. Most of my teachers at Temple were Jews. My creative writing teacher was a Jew. I was a counselor at a Jewish camp. So I was totally inundated by this Jewish culture at this point, and it had the effect on me that basically I stopped going to church because I thought they had a more plausible explanation of the way the world functioned.
My experience was quite different in that when I grew up in a Catholic community, and in many ways I'm culturally Catholic for that reason, I suppose, but the Jewish friends that I had were actually much more conservative, a little bit more moral oriented, a bit more family oriented, a bit more, God-centered than most of my friends who were Catholic who were less so. So, I mean, it might have more of a reflection on the different cultures that we're exposed to, and I'm not suggesting that you don't have Jews who are outside of the faith and who are not religious, but I mean, it goes back to what I was suggesting, which is that I think that both Jews and Catholics in this country have been somewhat Protestantized. Not that I knew too many Protestants growing up. There's a kind of a materialist look, a secular look, a morally relative look. And I think that you like to talk about categories. I would contend that the main category that drives that engine is the communist category. And whether people involved in communism are Jewish or whatever, Catholic or Protestant, or in Russia, I suppose Russian Orthodox, is almost the secondary aspect of what they're into. They're atheists, and they're.
Well, I think what has happened over this period of time is the categories, political categories, left and right, have been replaced by ethnic categories. Protestant, Catholic, Jew. That's what's happened in my life. I started off as a conservative, but as I said, at a certain point, it has no meaning anymore. And I'm saying that we had by the way, we're getting outside the framework of my book. Exactly. I'm getting outside of it now. Okay, maybe we should just go back to the book. Yeah. But I mean, the change of like neoconservatism, the rise of neoconservatism, which was a Jewish political movement, kind of relativized the whole left and right category. But I'm saying that for American identity, at least as I see it in my book, the Jews did not become relevant until well into the 20th century. I'd say the 1920s. And the guy I dealt with in this regard was Walter Lippmann, who basically, I think, got to the heart of the matter, understood the Achilles heel of American political life, which is basically, it doesn't work. really well. He talked about it as Jeffersonian democracy in his book, Public Opinion. Jeffersonian democracy doesn't work because the world is too complicated. I think that what we're talking about here is this going back to before that to this religious, the Protestant sects who were all infallible because of sola scriptura. You can't talk to people who believe that. You cannot talk to them.
No, I agree with you. I mean, the only thing that's infallible is God and the word of God. No sect is infallible. No man is infallible. We're all imperfect beings under God.
Except the Pope, who is infallible.
Oh, okay.
But so what was Walter Lippmann's solution? Well, he said you need experts, and I think this is the beginning of what he meant was Jews. You need Jews to run the thing for you. Jews like Kissinger, Henry Kissinger. I'm jumping way ahead.
Yeah, why not?
But you need experts like Eastern Europeans. They're all experts at something or other, and that was the beginning of the rise of Jewish influence on WASP culture. The man who really took what Lippmann said to heart was Harry Luce, who created Time magazine based on what he read, Lippmann's understanding of how you need to form. You need these icons or you need paradigms, and because most people can't think abstractly. And so you present a paradigm and the American imitates the paradigm. And so Harry Luce did it. Time magazine had a picture of some guy on the cover. It was always a picture of some guy on the cover. And that was your entry into the story because you can see the guy. And I mean, I think I was influenced by Time magazine.
Yeah, and Life magazine even more so.
Time magazine was for people who can't think, and Life magazine was for people who can't read. Okay. And we got both in our house, and I broke my collarbone when I was 12 years old, and I didn't have anything to do, so I read Time magazine. And it had I talked to my father based on categories that we both derived from Time magazine. Mm-hmm. It was an incredibly influential, it was the cutting edge.
It was the only one
of identity. I'd say the cutting edge of identity formation in America at that period of time, were before the rise of television, when movies were still, movies were around too. I mean, so what you also had was the paradigm of the paradigmatic American, like Gary Cooper, and someone who a Jew who understood that was Ayn Rand. So she comes over here and she's enamored. She loves America. So she writes The Fountainhead, which is the kind of the Jewish idea of what America is. And she demanded that Gary Cooper play the lead role in that movie because she understood the power of paradigms. Now, I'm saying at that point, nobody knew, as far as I can tell, the Jewish influence on The Fountainhead was invisible because only the insiders knew that Hollywood was Jewish. This is before that movie. I'm confusing it with the Virginia. The Virginia came out in 1929. Fountainhead is 1940. The big conflict in American life came in the 1920s when everybody started to get upset about Hollywood, which they perceived as Jewish. And so they had to bring the Hays Code in, and then the big battle came between the Catholics and the Jews over the Legion of Decency and the Production Code.
It was Jewish. I mean, you had several big Jewish families who couldn't make movies in New York because of anti-Semitism, moved to L.A. and include the Warner Brothers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, all of those guys, and they developed this incredible industry. I think that. The heyday of Hollywood actually had a very great moral image. I mean, including very pro-Catholic. The Bells of St. Mary was
right.
I mean, they were great, and they were Jewish. Well,
I think America was a better place when the Catholics kept the Jews in line.
Could be.
And the Production Code. The classic example of that was the Production Code from 1933 up until 1965. Joe Breen basically determined what type of movie was going to be. Catholic guy who actually went to the same college I went to in Philadelphia. I think America was a better place when the Catholics could hold this Jewish tendency to subversion in check?
I think that's a reasonable position. I mean, the Jew is outside of the sort of the mainstream. I mean, you mentioned the managers and the Lippmann wanting to have like a council of experts, or what the Bible talks about, the council of elders, which was developed by Jethro to help Moses get the load off his back in terms of governing. And that is a theme that runs through European history. I think that you always have Jewish experts. I think they played a role in Catholic and Protestant countries. I think
the Hofjude, who was usually a finance guy, who would lend the prince money.
That's right. And also, even in the Vatican itself, the Jews were great polyglots. They could interpret and translate documents. They were doctors. They were into medicine. They were into the arts. They were into a lot of diplomacy. There were a lot of things that the Jews developed to a high skill. We could talk about how that happened, but a lot of it is based on this idea that the Jew is outside of the actual society. Right. They didn't have their own country.
No country allowed Jews to be citizens before Napoleon did it.
That's right.
And so they were tolerated as resident aliens. I think this may have contributed to the fact that I got along so well with Jews at this period of time. We're talking about the period right around when the Jews broke the production code. So all of these people, all the Jews I knew were at least 20 years older than me, who had always been raised during this period that I'm talking about, 33 to 65. That's when they all came into maturity. That's when they kind of learned the ropes of what it meant to be an American. And I think it was a much more homogeneous society at that point. If I think that the man who broke this was Philip Roth.
Oh yeah,
and I think Portnoy's Complaint was the book that broke it.
Absolutely obscene.
It changed, had a fundamental change about Jewish identity. Philip Roth put the oi back in goy. He put the id back in yid. That's what he said.
Not one of the prouder members of the tribe. Put it that way.
Well, there was one rabbi who said we're going to suffer because of this. He actually said that when this book came out.
The book was banned in my household. Jonathan Ginsburg, a sociologist at Johns Hopkins, who wrote a book called The Fatal Embrace, Jews and the State. And it deals with some of the things we're talking about, in that the Jew in the Middle Ages and throughout the diaspora, they were stateless. They lived under the favor of the prince, and that prince die and a new prince could come in and exile them or worse. And then they would try to curry favor. And the result was you had people who would serve a function for the state, make themselves useful in exchange for some level of protection and freedom. But there was a subservience. The result was a sort of psychology where the Jew became more subservient to the dominant culture, and they would embrace that culture. And that was for the better and for the worse. You know, we saw some of the worst examples, to bring things up till today, in the Biden administration, where you had Jews who were really not the best. I mean, they were internationalists, they were open borders, they were into some of the worst elements of that regime. I would say that now, under Trump, you have Jews who are working for the better, right? People like Stephen Miller and Howard Lutnick, the commerce guy, and Lee Zeldin at Environmental Protection, who was the pro-life congressman who ran for governor of New York against the pro-choice Catholic Kathy Hochul. So, we have, people on both sides, but at the same time, there is this insecurity, this ghetto mentality, where the Jew feels not that they have to sort of embrace the authoritarian, out of fear. And I think it's a problem, not to get into this, but I think it's a problem in Israeli society. And that a lot of the issue we have ahead of us is to overcome this ghetto mentality, stop trying to censor people, and stand up and be who we are and argue our faith and our positions, and do so without fear.
Yep. I think it's I don't think Jews are capable of self-rule because they don't have limits. They need to have limits imposed upon them. I think we had a benign meeting equilibrium at a certain point in American history, and I think it's gone now. I mean, the fact that IPAC controls the Congress, this disgusting spectacle of 50 or 20 or 30 standing ovations when Netanyahu shows up here, it's out of control and it's going to cause a reaction. And the problem is, I don't think the Jews understand what they're doing now. I don't understand. I don't think a guy like Mark Levine or Rabbi Shmuley understands the effect that they have when they act out in public. It brings about the exact opposite of what they say they intend. I'm going to put Jonathan Greenblatt into the same box here with them. He announced that for the first time in the ADL's history, that the younger generation is more anti-Semitic than the older generation. Now, why he wasn't fired? Why wasn't he fired? Why wasn't that evidence that, Jonathan, you're not doing your job? We're seeing one instance after another of this blindness on the part of Jews who don't understand the effect they're having on the public.
This gets into what I'm saying here about the ghetto mentality, this insecurity, and that like the AIPAC wants to have influence on the U.S. Congress to take a more pro-Israel position, but they don't have to be so strenuous about it because the American people are pro-Israel, both left and right, both Democrat and Republican, going all the way back. I mean, we could talk
I think you should say they were pro-Israel. I don't think they're pro-Israel anymore.
I mean, maybe a little less so. I agree. I mean, this kind of unholy alliance between the radical Islamists and the radical left has eroded some of the support. But that support is part of American sense of, well, there's on two fronts. On the one hand, it's sense of fairness about the idea of national sovereignty and the development of independence. On the other hand, there's a spiritual element to it in terms of biblical prophecy and fulfillment. Truman, when he recognized Israel, everybody was against it, and for good reason. I mean, Israel likes to talk about it being indispensable as an ally to the United States. I disagree with that. I don't think they are at all. I think the United States would be better off getting rid of Israel and making money with the oil countries, right? And all the resources.
I think the majority of the Americans agree with you now.
No,
I think what we saw again, this collapse of what was an alliance. Let's call it the Judeo-Christian alliance. The collapse, I think, was the murder of Charlie Kirk. Once you see guys like Glenn Beck, okay, he's a former Catholic who's now a Mormon. He had to have an operation that removed 90% of his brain before he could become a Mormon, but now he's a Mormon, okay? And now he tries to pick up the bloody microphone and he gives a speech, and the first thing that some kid asks him now is, are you America first or are you Israel first? That's the fundamental issue. It's not going to go away anymore. It's out there.
Well, yeah, I suppose it would be like asking a Catholic if they're Vatican first or America first. But putting that aside, my point with Truman is that everyone in the
Vatican, by the way, does not get billions of dollars in aid from the United States government.
I
the
agree.
Vatican does not have an army that is being, well, anyway, we're again,
and not to go
Charles, we're getting away from the book I wrote
we
here.
Are. And I agree with you. Israel shouldn't take that money. They don't need to. They just signed a $3.4 billion deal with Greece for arms trades. And they don't really need, it's like maybe it's part of this ghetto mentality. They should tell the American government not to send the money, and they should then be free to be a sovereign nation and do what they need to do.
Right.
But putting that aside, Truman had opposition from the whole establishment, the Council on Foreign Relations, Secretary Marshall, Secretary Forrestal. They all don't recognize Israel because it's going to hurt your position, the United States, in terms of these business contacts and oil and resources. It's going to piss off all the Arab countries. But he went ahead and did it anyways. And the American people understood that and stood by him for doing that. even though it didn't help America in terms of hardcore material gain. And he did it because it was the thing to do. There's a spiritual component. There's something about Israel that transcends, I don't know, reason. And like, while I consider myself to be America first, and I make that no bones about that, I don't see that as contradicting my support for Israel. And I think that, yeah, there's been some erosion thanks to a lot of propaganda and lies about Israel. But I think ultimately the destinies are intertwined, and that Israel has a better argument to make for its right to
Well,
exist.
I'm sure you were heartened by Mike Huckabee. Did that give you a warm feeling as an American?
Talking
Uh, what's that?
You're talking to Jonathan Pollard. Is that your question about
Yeah,
that?
did that give you a warm feeling
No,
when
I think
Huckabee met with Jonathan Pollard, the greatest traitor in American history, or even more, this bringing 1,000 Christian Zionist ministers over to Israel and telling them if you don't support Israel, God will curse you.
Well, let me just answer that. First of all, yeah, that Pollard is a traitor and he served his time and he's not a good figure. I don't think he's the worst traitor in American history. I think that would be Alger Hiss and the people giving nuclear secrets to the Russians. He was trying to give Israel information that for whatever reason this government was withholding from them and probably shouldn't have been. That doesn't justify it. He gave secrets over to another nation, not an enemy, and that for that he's a traitor and he should have done hard time. As far as Christian Zionism is concerned, they're more supportive of Israel than a lot of Jews, and
right.
I think that their position is consistent with the Torah. Let me ask you about this business with the Scofield Bible. I've heard that somehow was a Judaizing element that was snuck into the Christian Bible. I mean, what was it about that was contradicting the actual Torah in the Bible?
It revolves around the word Israel. Did you see the interview with Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz? Ted Cruz is a flaming Christian Zionist, and Tucker says, so by Israel, are you saying that guy in the Old Testament is somehow the same as means you have to support the Netanyahu government? And he says, yes. No, that's the equivocate. If you want to talk about the whole equivoc, basically, Scofield wrote a Bible, notes to a Bible that were totally Zionist in orientation. Again, we're talking about Protestants, people who broke with the authority of the Catholic Church. Who gave this guy, Scofield, this con man, the right to be the interpreter of the Bible? Who gave him that authority? No one. Do you know who? I'll answer the question, though. It was Louis Untermeyer. It was the Untermeyer family, Jewish family in New York, had serious literary connections. Louis Untermeyer was a poet, and Untermeyer took it and got the Oxford University Press to publish this Scofield Bible. And that is prestige. That prestige has sent this thing, gave it the authority that it has had basically to this day.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm critical of Netanyahu and his government, and I've been critical of Israeli governments. There's a difference between being critical of Israeli governments and society and not supporting Israel's right to exist as a society. As far as the Scofield Bible, I mean, what is it that he did? I mean, what did he put in there that was so contradictory to the text of the Bible? I mean,
it's an interpretation. He has an interpretation, an equivocation on the word Israel, which is one of Abraham's children. And he's therefore saying that because of this, because Abraham said, because of the Abrahamic covenant or something like that, therefore what? That these Polish revolutionaries have a right to come to Palestine and basically drive the people out? That's not, what should I say?
You can debate that. But
let me put it this way. I'm talking to Huckabee now and Cruz. Okay, as an American, you're free to believe whatever you want about the Bible. But when you start commandeering Americans' men treasure and sending it off to this country over which we apparently have no control, you're going to get pushback. You're violating you're violating the American agreement, which is basically, okay, you can have your religion. Okay, you weren't here at the beginning. You were, but that didn't figure largely in the founding of the United States of America, and neither did Catholics. Okay? But we had this modus vivendi, and now it's being violated in a particularly violent manner, and there's going to be a reaction. And it could be a violent reaction. If things keep going this way, it could turn violent.
Well, again, we can debate on whether or not Israel should get to degrees of or any American aid, and I generally think they should wean themselves off of that teat, frankly. But you know, the idea that there is language in the Torah that says that nations that bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. There's no way to
That's not about a nation. That is about a son of Abraham.
Yeah,
has nothing to do about modern nations. That's the crux of the disagreement.
But it's also that at that same talk, God commanded Abraham to go up to this land that I will show you. This tiny, miserable speck of land between the Jordan River and the sea that I shall give to you and your inheritance.
Okay. I understand I understand that interpretation. That is not the Catholic interpretation. The Catholic interpretation is basically that there is no covenant anymore except the new covenant, which was founded by Jesus Christ. Okay, I understand that. I understand that. I'm not trying to force my Catholic interpretation on the Jews, but the Jews are trying to force their interpretation on me. First of all, with abortion, that was the law of the land. Secondly, with foreign aid to Israel, and so on and so forth. This is violating the kind of pact that Americans had. So the question is let's get back to the book. I keep trying to get back to the book.
Okay.
Is this helpful? Is the book helpful in understanding American identity? And if it's helpful, understand that, can we arrive at a better modus vivendi than the one we have right now?
Jim, I'm kind of just, my mind is still on what we were just talking about. I think that we do have a different interpretation of what is meant by the covenant. I would argue that Jesus himself said that the covenant is forever in the book of Acts and in the book of Matthew. And that's what I believe, and that's what Jews believe. The Mosaic covenant is forever until the end of time.
The Mosaic covenant is obsolete.
Okay,
it became. I'm telling you from the Catholic point of view. I'll give you the reason. It became obsolete the minute that the temple was destroyed, because the Jews have no priesthood, no sacrifice, and no temple anymore, and they can't fulfill the Mosaic covenant. So what they did was then switch to synagogue Judaism. They created a shul. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked for permission from the Roman emperor to start schools. He started a school at Yavna, and basically you've had a debating society ever since. But you can't fulfill the Mosaic covenant unless you have a temple, and there's no temple.
Well, first of all, the temple isn't even in the Torah, but fulfilled it by very elaborate means of worship. And in the same way that Catholics have the Mass, which is a substitute for the actual functioning of Jesus, I mean, that's, you and I don't agree on that. I would argue that we don't need the physical temple. I mean, you have to, what I refer to is the work of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who writes about that extensively, and particularly in his book called The Sabbath, that we are observing the morals and the precepts of the Torah. The temple is just a small part of it. We pray that we can rebuild the temple at the right time. But we have set the stage for that by reasserting the land of Israel, and then in 1967.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. I understand. We have obviously we have different religious orientation here, but as Americans, I'm saying we need an adjustment right now, because things are way out of line, way out of line. You've got 2% of the population. What percentage do you have? And go down the list. What about the Biden administration? You had 400 Jews in the Biden administration. The Biden's minion. They called it a minion. It was way beyond a minion. Things are out of balance. And when they're out of balance, there's going to be a reaction. And I'm saying we have to come back to some better modus vivendi than what we have right now. We've got, in a sense, I'm saying that we have a kind of crisis right now. I think we're at the end of the Third Republic. I think that one of the casualties of the Third Republic is going to be Protestantism, which was the main vector of identity in American history. We're going to have an identity crisis because of that. We're also seeing the rise of Islam in America, the election of Mamdani, or the rise of coalitions that will put Muslims into power. All of this stuff needs to be considered at this moment in time.
I agree
because the situation we have now is untenable. It's an untenable situation. Everybody realizes that. And so how are we going to make course corrections? Or who's going to propose the course correction? We have Melanie Phillips in England, Jewish lady, who gave a speech saying basically, all right, no more Mr. Nice Guy. We're gonna double down. No, Melanie, don't do that. That's the wrong approach. Wrong approach. And I'm saying if you follow people like this, if the Jews follow people like this, we're going to have more and more conflict.
I agree. And I think that we may have a difference of opinion with regard to categories, but I would argue that a coming together of God-fearing and religious Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, and even possibly Muslims, is necessary to counter this secular, illuminated, frankly, satanic sect that has basically taken over time American culture and American life. Anyways, Dr. Jones, as always, thank you for joining me. Always interesting, for sure. And perhaps we'll talk again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles.